I wanted to talk a bit about relationships today, and this is a little bit of a freestyle, so we'll just sort of see how it goes. Just some stuff that's kind of on my mind, I suppose. Um, I think that the first thing to say is that people have this idea that the dating coach industry, it's this incredibly sleazy sort of thing about trying to snare and sleep with as many women as possible and all of that. And in actual fact, the reality is that most of the guys, I would say 99.9% of guys that approach me for help or DM me or send me an email. And by the way, you're welcome to do that. My email is troy@realtroyfrancis if you've got any questions, or you can DM me on my socials. But the majority of the guys, usually the first thing I'm going to say is, okay, so what are you looking for? What's your ideal outcome here? And most of them, to be honest, say, well, in the end, just want to find a nice girl, a nice woman, and I want to settle down, and probably have a family. Not everybody, but most people probably want to have a family, and just have that stability. And I think it's a bit of a misconception. I mean, certainly, I don't know. Maybe there are other channels, maybe there are other coaches that are serving a sort of different market. But certainly for me, most of the guys that I'm dealing with are looking for that. They're looking for a relationship, and there are then varying degrees of what experience they've had because, some of these guys have been married. We've had people who've been married for 20 years and they've come out of divorce and now they're spending a bit of time enjoying themselves. But even those people tend to, in the end, say, well, if I met someone nice, I would settle down again. Maybe not get married, but they would certainly settle down again. And then we've got people who, have basically had no experience whatsoever, right? They've had zero dating experience. They haven't had relationships and so on and so forth. And so there's quite a big spectrum of people, but most of them tend to be looking for the same thing. And the tricky part of this is that I don't think that you can wholeheartedly say to anybody that having a relationship is going to be the nirvana that you think it is. It's gonna make you happy. It's not to say that relationships are bad. It's not to say that you can't be happy and fulfilled within a relationship. Of course you can. That is the goal. That is the aim for most people, and it absolutely can happen. But what it is true to say is that just as being single, or just as being single and not being able to find anybody is challenging and emotionally problematic and so on, relationships themselves also bring problems. It's just that there are a different set of problems and different nature of problems, and suddenly you're dealing not just with yourself and with your own feelings, but you're dealing with the feelings of another person as well, and the moods of another person as well, and the proclivities and the challenges that they're facing. Suddenly they become your challenges. They become another thing that you need to consider. And so this is by no means an anti-relationship video at all. I've been accused by people in my life of being very sort of anti-monogamy and anti-relationships and stuff like that. And look, in the past, 6 or 7 years ago, I certainly did some pretty polarizing tweets about monogamy and the impossibility of monogamy and all the rest of it. And this video is not about that either. What I would say is that I think monogamy is possible, and I think it's desirable, actually, if you're going to be in a committed relationship. I certainly wouldn't entertain any kind of polygamous kind of thing myself. I certainly wouldn't want my partner to be messing around with anybody else. I wouldn't want to be messing around with anybody else. So I think in the context of if you're going to do it, if you're going to be in a relationship, then you should be in a relationship, and it should be monogamous. But monogamy has to be something that you choose. It has to be an active decision that you make, right? And monogamy, I think, has become more challenging for people over the years, simply because of the amount of choice that people have. There are dating apps out there aplenty where you can just go on there and pretty much, swipe and order someone to come around like you're ordering a pizza, So that adds an extra layer of challenge, but it needn't, because regardless of availability. Just because something's available, it doesn't mean you have to go and buy it. You know, like, so for example, if I don't drink, so alcohol is readily available. There are shops all around where I live. There's a bar just over here, right, selling alcohol. I could go and buy, you know, a nice old fashioned now, or a nice martini now, shaken not stirred, and, you know, no problem. No one's going to stop me, but I don't, because I choose not to. And it's the same thing with monogamy, right? It's like, just because you can, it doesn't mean you have to. So the element of choice, the fact that there is, or there appears to be, this multiplicity of choice out there, I think has made it tricky for people. And there's also the element of comparison as well, because you've got Instagram, and then people are looking at other people on Instagram, and of course we all know it's kind of the highlight reel. Really, it's not really, it's real life, but it's curated real life. So you're seeing the best bits of what they're doing, and you're comparing it to yourself, and you're thinking, oh damn, you know, their lifestyle looks really great, if only I could be like this. So all of these things make it appear like you have a lot of options, and perhaps you do. I mean, maybe not you personally. It depends where you are watching this video. I think women, certainly on the surface, would seem to have a lot of options, right? Because women, you know, guys are very visual. Guys are pretty thirsty. Guys will slide into anyone's DMs and pretty much proposition them and whatever. And it's not hard for most relatively attractive women, and even, you know, some might say less attractive women to garner a lot of attention online. Okay, that's fair enough. It's probably harder for the average guy, but it's not impossible. And there are plenty of guys who are crushing it on the dating apps, or they're finding other methods, you know, through social circle, or through just going out and meeting people in public. That still happens, believe it or not. You know, so guys also have these opportunities. Not every guy. I think it is harder for guys in that first bit, which is the bit that we talk about probably the most in these videos, and on my channel and on Tusk's channel and everything else. We're talking about the initial attraction phase mostly, because that's the bit that some guys have a problem with. How do I find somebody to interact with in the first place? Okay, women seem to have a bit less of that problem, but then the issue for women is, well, what is the quality of the guys who are approaching them, right? Of the guys who are sliding into the DMs, or liking their pictures, or, you know, hitting them up or whatever. Like, what quality are those guys? Are those guys really the kind of guys that they want to be with? And then you've then got the further problem of, okay, well, even if this guy is somewhat desirable, or he is ticking some of the boxes, A, is he a good fit for long term? And B, is he going to commit to me? Okay, and that's, so women tend to have this problem at the latter end of the process, if that makes sense, whereas men have the problem more at the beginning. So the bottleneck for women is later, whereas the bottleneck for men is earlier on, in general. Okay, I mean, obviously it's different for everybody, but that's just a kind of top line overview sort of thing. But in terms of relationships themselves, you know, you get into a relationship with somebody. Now, I think it was the great poet Robbie Williams, although he may not have come up with this, but I certainly remember reading an interview with Robbie, who I'm kind of a fan of, by the way. I like him. He's same age as me. He's got a family now. He's married. Seems happy. He's been through a lot of addiction problems, similar kinds of stuff to it that I've dealt with. Actually, he's kind of always found him kind of an interesting character. Anyway, I remember reading an interview with him some years ago, and he said, in your life, when you're born, or when you reach adolescence or whatever, you're given two sets of tokens. You're given a set of sex tokens, or, like, let's say, attraction tokens, and then you're given a set of love tokens. And the set of attraction tokens is far bigger than the set of love tokens, right? So what he meant by that was, yes, you can meet people and they're attractive and you want to, you know, interact with them, you want to hook up with them, whatever, but they're not necessarily going to be right for you for a longer term thing. And the people who are right for you, and the people you have that real connection with, it tends to be a far, far smaller group. It could only be one person in your life, or a couple of people, you know, where you feel that you really have that connection with. And that's, I think, one thing that makes relationships difficult, because if you do find somebody who fits that bill, then obviously it makes it very hard to leave that person, even if things become difficult for whatever reason. Okay, because you know in the back of your head that it's going to be very hard to replace that, to find somebody else where that connection is as deep, if that makes sense. And I do genuinely believe this. This is sounding a bit more like mainstream dating stuff, but I do genuinely believe that to be the case. People will say to me, no, you can just get a connection with it. You can have good times with anybody, have a connection with anybody. Well, yeah, kind of, but in my time on this planet, which is, half a century or whatever, my experience is that finding people in the love token side of the equation, it's very rare. It's very, very rare. Okay. And then within the relationship itself, and this is again partly fueled probably by social media and Instagram culture and dating apps and things like that, the issue of trust becomes paramount, because since we know that there are a lot of options out there and a lot of opportunities and so on, it then makes it hard for the partners in the relationship to trust one another, or it can do, if they give them, if the person gives them cause to seem untrustworthy. And the problem, one of the problems that I've had, and this is without going into too much detail or anything, or getting to anything personal, but I am inherently not somebody who's going to come across as being very trustworthy, because of partly the life that I've led, partly the sort of work that I do, I suppose some of the content that I put out. I mean, I would say my content really is pretty mild, really. I've always striven to pursue a middle ground, if you like. I mean, you've got some very contentious content creators out there who are, misogynistic, or they're bordering on or whatever, and maybe they're doing it for shock value, maybe they believe some of it, I don't know, whatever. I mean, I've always tried to take to be very balanced and sort of to remain in the center, because partly because that's just, largely because that's just what I believe, right? I think that you have to take a lot of the hyperbole that we read online with a large pinch of salt, because just because somebody has the ability to do something, so the ability to be unfaithful or whatever, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to do it in all circumstances. Okay, so but the reality is we are living in a society that's pretty loose. I think I likened the other night to my girlfriend, I was likening the modern dating scene to going and buying toilet rolls at Lidl. You run out of toilet paper and you're like, oh, damn, I've run out of toilet paper. I'll just go down to the local Lidl, which, for those of you who don't know, who don't live in Europe, is a low-cost supermarket, and I'll just buy another set of toilet roll. It's kind of that easy, right? Which was a rather cynical and slightly unpleasant analogy to make about modern love, but it's what it feels like sometimes. It's what it feels like. It feels kind of superficial. But the problem with someone like me is that if my partner knows what I do, and my partner currently obviously does know what I do and everything else, that in itself builds in an inherent issue around the subject of trust. And then on top of that, personal history, things that have happened in the past, etc., etc. Now, it's always said, and this again is a mainstream thing, it's always said, trust is the most important part of a relationship, and it's a hoary old cliche. Hoary spelled Hoary, not as in with a W, not like hooker. It's a hoary old cliche, but it is true, because you need to have trust, okay? Particularly today, particularly in 2025, because if you compromise trust, then what are you really left with? On both sides. So on my side and then on the female side, there has to be trust there, because otherwise, what are you really left with? Because we're in this sort of this modern soup of relationships, or sort of hookup culture, or whatever you call it now, where it's pretty much like anything goes. Anybody can kind of do anything they want, and they have the means to do it, because of the technology, because of the apps, because of messaging, because of private messaging, whatever, And And so once trust is compromised, it becomes very, very difficult to get that back and to retain it, okay? Even if, you are somebody who is doing their best to be equitable in the service of the relationship, okay? Even if you are somebody who is trying to turn over a new leaf. I mean, my girlfriend will often say to me, well, can somebody ever really change? I think they can. And I believe with men particularly, actually, it comes along with age. Now, I'm a slight outlier here because I'm older than... I mean, a lot of guys, they start to settle down when they hit around 30 or their mid-30s or whatever. For me, obviously, that process may have taken a bit longer. But one thing I can tell you from experience of being a little bit older is that the white-hot desire to go out and get validation or get that cheap dopamine from meaningless encounters is reduced. It really, really is reduced significantly. Okay, and actually, if you were watching my videos in the last 3 years, I mean, I'm talking going back to like 2021, 22, there was a lot of videos. Ironically, some of my most popular videos ever were these pretty dark, dour videos of me just walking around going, I'm sick of relationships. What's the point of relationships anymore? It's all over. Not heading towards a black pill kind of narrative, but more of a sort of, I felt like I prematurely reached the end of my the romantic aspect of my life, and then I was destined for bachelorhood or whatever. I don't feel like that today. But that was how I felt at the time. And I could conceivably see myself, if I were in a position to ever be single again, I could certainly see myself sort of heading back towards that. Because, and I don't necessarily say that as a bad thing. It's just that when you're young, particularly as a guy and as a woman as well, but particularly as a guy, you do have this very, very strong urge to go out and sow your wild oats. Okay, it's just, we all know that, it's a fact. Okay, it becomes a lot less as you get older, and in many ways, I welcome that. I really welcome that because I think that it means the monkey's off your back to some extent, if that expression makes sense. That desire, that kind of compulsion, that almost addictive sort of those patterns of behavior, they become decreased, okay? And it opens you up to all these other things, right? It opens you up to all these other things that are arguably more important, like, doing creative work or working on a business or travel or becoming just interested in different things. I heard a thing on the radio the other day about a study that had been done that showed that as you get older, your curiosity actually increases. Okay, and I found actually that my curiosity has significantly increased about things that I would have had no interest in a decade ago or a couple of decades ago. I can get really, really interested in politics or in, which I know a lot of you guys are, so fine, or sort of history or even sort of financial things that I would have had no interest in before. I suddenly find I can get really fascinated with those things. So my curiosity has increased, and the desire to sort of go out and just do random stuff has reduced. Okay, and like I say, I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. I actually think it's kind of a good thing in a way. It's one of the consolations of getting a little bit older, is that you just don't have that white hot heat and desire to engage in sort of questionable and sort of promiscuous behavior any longer, if you ever did. But to this issue of trust, I mean, it really is so important. And how do you ever really trust somebody? Well, it's very, very hard. I think naturally probably I find it relatively hard to trust people, I think. I mean, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt if I can at the beginning. But at the same time, obviously, you've got to observe them over a period of time. And, and that's why I always say that you shouldn't fall too hard too deeply with people, because it just... you don't really know them. We get guys and they're like, oh, I'm with my girlfriend and, we're doing this, we're doing that. And it's like, well, how long have you been with her? It's like 3 months. And it's like, well, with all due respect, after 3 months, you hardly know somebody, okay? It takes a while to get to know somebody. And even then, in the early stages, everybody's putting on their best possible mask, right? It's only after a period of time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe even longer, that you start to see below the surface a little bit and you start to get to know that person more. So I would counsel anybody watching this to not to forego commitment, but at the same time to just be a little bit wary that you don't get into something, too quickly, and then realize it was a mistake. Trust, very difficult. And as I say, I think that being completely candid and transparent with you guys, as a boyfriend, I'm certainly somebody who is hard to trust, not because I'm doing anything, but just because of the nature of who I am and the way that I've conducted myself in the past and everything else added together. So that makes it incredibly difficult. So even with the best will in the world, I can come into, I can come into difficulties with that. And then, of course, trusting the other person and trusting when you're in a relationship, I think I've talked about this before, but I think part of it is picking your battles, okay? Because there might be things that you see as being, if not red flags, sort of like amber flags, or there might be things that you observe and you think, is that quite right? And you've got to really weigh up, in my opinion, the value of that person to you, the value of the relationship versus the whatever the evidence is that something dodgy may have happened. And if on overall your gut feeling is like, I think that this is a relatively innocent thing, it might be better just to let it go. But look, there are degrees of this. You could discuss it in the comments, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Obviously, cheating, physical cheating, completely verboten. I believe messaging other people is verboten as well. I don't think there should be flirty messages going on. I don't think there should be messages with exes going on or anything like that. If you're in a relationship that is founded in monogamy and you guys are meant to be together, I don't think that's acceptable. Okay, so if that stuff is happening, then okay, that's verboten. That shouldn't be allowed. But within that, is there a little bit of latitude? Maybe sometimes. I think you need to look at behaviour as a whole. You need to look at holistically what's happening. Okay, so you might see something on social media that she's posted, you think, oh, that's a bit strange. But then look at the rest of her behaviour. Is she suddenly disappearing off for, weekends and turning off her phone and, things like this? Is she really hard to get hold of sometimes? If there's a number of things that it adds up and there seems to be a pattern, then that's the time to address it. If not, then I would counsel, if not, and the relationship is worth something to you because this is a person that you feel you have that special bond with, that special connection, I would counsel not to ignore it, but to kind of just put a hold for a moment and just take a step back, take a deep breath, and just observe what's happening. And obviously, if you see further red flags, you're going to have to address it. But that's for further down the line. So, really, really difficult in the modern world for trust to be established and trust to be maintained and then trust to be regained if it is compromised, okay? So really, I guess my advice here is if you find a good one, if you find somebody and you actually do want to make a go of it with her, then just be very careful and just think about what you could lose. Because as I said, these connections which are sort of deep and meaningful and that sounds cringe, but you know what I mean, that real bond, it's pretty rare. It's not to say you can't get on with other people. It's not to say you can't find somebody else you think, oh, they're attractive and they're kind of fun to be with, but are you really going to have that same deep bond? Probably not. It only comes around once in a lifetime, a couple of times in a lifetime. Okay, this I would say now before people start talking about one-itis and stuff in the comments. I'm just trying to be realistic here. I'm just trying to talk from my own experience. It's not to say that you can't be a marauding bachelor and do what the hell you want if that's what you want to do, if that's your lifestyle. But if you are inclined towards some sort of stability or sort of building something a bit more with somebody, and you find somebody where there's this sort of deeper understanding, and it's really intangible as well. It's really hard to explain. Like, sometimes it's with somebody on the surface, you wouldn't even appear to have that much in common, but there's just this real depth of just something about the way you are together. It's something in the DNA, okay? When you find that, you have to value that, and you have to be really, really careful not to violate that trust, because once that trust is violated, it is very, very difficult to get it back, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes a leap of faith on the part of the other person, and it's just unfair, and it's just unfair on the other person, okay? As it would be unfair on you if the same thing happened to you, okay? And in the end, I guess everyone just has to make their own choices in these situations about what they choose to do if they see something that makes them unhappy. I mean, obviously, if you're in something which is toxic and is undeniably toxic and the evidence is there, then you should remove yourself, ultimately. But there again, we have to recognize we live in a very complex world where things can be misconstrued and errors can happen, and sometimes you have to balance your feelings of outrage with a sense of, okay, so what is the greater good here? Is the relationship the greater good, or is this apparent infringement? Does that outweigh it? But that's for each person to decide on their own terms. Anyway, enough of that for today. I hope all of that made some sense to somebody, or you found it of interest. If you are in a relationship and you're experiencing this kind of stuff, please reach out to me. You can email me, troy@realtroyfrancis.com, or you can hit me up on one of my socials, Twitter, X, or Instagram @realtroyfrancis. Put your WhatsApp details in. We can have a quick free call to talk about coaching options, because I do offer coaching in this area. And we'll go from there. But yeah, if you find a good one, and you find somebody you want to keep hold of, then make sure you keep that trust intact, fellas, because once it is compromised, then, you're in stormy waters, and you're going to have to work very hard to get it back, if you can. With that being said, hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please subscribe on YouTube or on Spotify or on whatever platform you are consuming this on, and I'll see you guys again very soon. Bye-bye.